has brought together scholars from 4 continents to discuss language matters and their interdisciplinary perspectives. I'm really proud and honored to greet our colleagues from 24 countries, and they are Algeria, Armenia, Bulgaria, Belarus, Egypt, Estonia, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Malaysia, Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Russia, Serbia, Spain, Tunisia, Turkey, Ukraine, the United Kingdom, and the United States. In this world, where people seem to find more and more issues to disagree about, it's very important to find a common tongue. But there is no language great enough to serve as the only vehicle to communicate our ideas and thoughts and desires. There emerge new written cultures with their literatures on the world scene that are to be translated and interpreted. Communication among states becomes more intense, and it really is very important how we communicate our thoughts, how we speak to each other. You have come to this symposium to share your thoughts in these matters. As there are 4 continents involved in the discussion, my desire were that you extended a friendly hand still to colleagues who would like to cooperate with you in the future, that is to Latin America, and to Asian Translators Association, who would also be very eager to become members of this international community of scholars. Let me express most sincere gratitude to the organizers of the symposium, the head of the Department of English Studies, Dr. Indra Karapetyan, the chief coordinator, Dr. Monica Farnester, and all the language departments of the Faculty of Humanities, for all the work they have invested and time they have shared. On behalf of the Senate of the University of Latvia, let me wish a very successful work, enjoyable stay in Riga, which is not only one of the capitals of the world, but also one of the capitals of blossoming lilacs. And next year, when Riga is going to become the cultural capital of Europe, I hope you will find your way back to Riga again. I wish you a very successful time and enjoyable time at our university.
And now I give the floor to Professor Ilse Rūniece, Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, University of Latvia.
Ekscelences, dārgie viesi, mīļie kolēģi, labs rīts visiem simpozija dalībniekiem un interesantiem. Excellencies, distinguished representatives of foreign embassies, the French Institute and the Goethe Institute, dear guests and colleagues. On behalf of the Faculty of Humanities, I am delighted to welcome you in Aula Magna, the most ceremonial hall of the University of Latvia. I am also really pleased that my colleagues have shown their high professionalism, collaboration skills, and scientific interest to bring together linguists from so many countries here in Riga to discuss and report on their research concerning the role of different languages and their instrumentality in international communication. I believe that today this theme is hyper-topical, the content of which is indeed highly variable and open to novelty of research. Being a classical philologist myself, permit me to say a few words in the language which is sustained research communication for centuries, especially long practiced in the academic environment, namely Latin. Salvete, collegae carissimi. Lingua donum preciosum homini datum est, sic dixit Aristoteles. Multae linguae donum preciosissimum sine dubitatione existimatur, quia conjunctionem inter nationes praeparat. Donum iste et instrumentum utilissimum in societate plurilingua nostra habemus. Sed ut instrumentum omne et lingua colenda et investiganda est, et semper erit. Hoc officium nostrum commune judicemus. Itaque homines linguistae eruditissimi ex diversis universitatibus Europae in Universitate Latviensi hodiernum symposium celebrant, parati ad discussiones frugiferas et in disciplina glottologica. Valde congratulor factum istum et successum omni linguae et omnibus collegis opto. Spero hostes symposii civitatis Rigae et universitatis nostrae hospitalitatem censuros esse. Allow me to wish the symposium success in listening, discussing, and gaining applicable results. And I wish to thank the organizers for this excellent academic feat. Visiem radošu veiksmi un atklājums turpmākam darbam un valodu funkcionalitātes pētījumiem nākotnē. Paldies!
Ladies and gentlemen, Her Excellency Doña Consuelo Femenia Guardiola, Ambassador of the Kingdom of Spain to the Republic of Latvia. Welcome.
Labrit, good morning. I will say a few words in Spanish for those who do not follow. It's just a few words of greeting and about the importance of Spanish language as a language of communication. Querida vicepresidenta del Senado de la Universidad, querida decana y también queridos organizadores y a la Facultad de Humanidades, en primer lugar, muchísimas enhorabuenas, muchísimas felicidades por la organización de este importante simposio que concentra a más de un centenar de participantes de distintos continentes y que por primera vez va a incluir un segmento de español. El español ha entrado con interés y con fuerza en los países bálticos. Espero que este simposio permita una mayor cooperación y una mayor conexión entre los lingüistas de los países bálticos y del mundo hispanohablante. Nosotros desde la Embajada reconocemos el vivo interés por el español que existe en Letonia y no podría ser seguramente de otra forma a la vista del crecimiento del español en el mundo internacional. El español en estos momentos es, por ejemplo, la tercera lengua en Internet, la segunda más utilizada en Twitter, una de las lenguas donde se puede encontrar más información en Internet, la segunda lengua después del chino por el número de personas nativas hablantes y en términos generales la segunda lengua como lengua de comunicación internacional con un gran potencial económico para los negocios, utilización política y diplomática, etc. Por lo tanto, les deseo a todos ustedes un feliz simposium, una fructífera estancia en Riga y otra vez como muestra de nuestro agradecimiento a la universidad y a los organizadores del simposium que han reconocido este potencial de futuro del español. Enhorabuena y muchas gracias.
I would like to invite here for the opening address, Monsieur Denis Duclos, Counselor on Cooperation and Cultural Affairs of the Embassy of France to the Republic of Latvia, also the Director of the French Institute of Latvia.
Excellences, Madame la représentante du vice-recteur, Madame la doyenne, chère Madame Ozoliņa, Mesdames et Messieurs.
Ekscelences, dekānis kundze, dārgā Ozoliņas kundze, dāmas un kungi.
Je souhaiterais tout d'abord vous remercier de votre invitation ce matin à l'Université de Lettonie pour l'ouverture de ce symposium, dont je me réjouis.
Vispirms es gribētu jums pateikt lielu paldies par uzaicinājumu piedalīties šorīt šī simpozija atklāšanā. Es esmu par to tiešām ļoti priecīgs.
Je constate que ce cycle de conférences reçoit une nouvelle fois un accueil très favorable de la part des professionnels, comme en témoigne le nombre de participants et le nombre de tables rondes dans 4 langues différentes, anglais, allemand, espagnol et français.
Es secinu, ka vēlreiz no jauna līdzdalība šajā simpozijā profesionāļu vidū ir bijusi uzskatīta par ļoti nozīmīgu, kā to apliecina daudzo dalībnieku skaits un arī apaļā galda diskusija, kas notiek 4 valodās – angļu, vācu, spāņu un franču.
En effet, des conférenciers lettons, mais aussi grecs, russes, français, tunisiens, algériens, italiens, norvégiens vont se succéder lors de ces 2 journées pour venir traiter de différents sujets, dont certains en français, les langues pour la communication et l'altérité de la linguistique et l'enseignement des langues. Il s'agit bien là d'une preuve de la vivacité de la langue française au sein de la vaste communauté francophone mondiale.
Kopumā līdzsvars lektoriem no Latvijas uzstāsies arī pārstāvji no Grieķijas, Krievijas, Francijas, Tunisijas, Alžīrijas, Itālijas, Norvēģijas, kuri 2 šo simpoziju dienu laikā viens aiz otra franču valodā, tostarp arī franču valodā, aplūkos vairākus nozīmīgus tematus, kuru vidū ir arī valodas saziņai un citādība no valodniecības līdz valodu apguvēji. Es to uztveru kā apliecinājumu franču valodas dzīvīgumam pasaules plašajā frankofonijas kopienā.
Cet engouement pour ce symposium signifie aussi, sans aucun doute, que des conférences liées à ce type de thématique répondent à une réelle attente en Lettonie.
Šī interese par šo simpoziju, es to noteikti uztveru arī kā apliecinājumu tam, ka konferences par šādām tēmām ir ļoti gaidītas Latvijā.
Cela démontre enfin l'intérêt que portent de nombreux chercheurs à la linguistique et en particulier à la langue française qui ne doit pas être seulement perçue comme une langue de diffusion de la culture, même si c'est un de ses rôles, mais aussi comme une langue de communication permettant de traiter dans de grandes institutions internationales, notamment de tout type de sujets, quel que soit leur domaine. C'est également une langue au service de l'économie.
Šīs simpozijas ir apliecinājums ne tikai daudzo zinātnieku un valodnieku interesē par valodniecību un īpaši par franču valodu, bet es uztveru to arī kā interesi par franču valodu, kas ir ne tikai kā kultūras izplatības valoda, bet vienlaiks tas ir arī saziņas līdzeklis daudzās starptautiskās konferencēs, kuras runā par ļoti dažādām tēmām un par atšķirīgām jomām, tostarp arī par ekonomiku.
Le plurilinguisme est, dans un monde qui s'uniformise de plus en plus, chaque jour davantage, une véritable richesse qu'il faut préserver, et vous tous, qui êtes ici présents, en êtes le témoignage.
Pasaulē, kas dienu jo dienas kļūst ar vien vienādāka, daudzveidība, daudzvalodība ir patiesa tās bagātība, un katrā ziņā tā ir jānosargā, un jūs šeit ar savu dalību šajā simpozijā esat tam apliecinājums.
Je remercie donc l'Université de Lettonie de permettre au plurilinguisme de s'exprimer à travers ce symposium, et je vous souhaite de très bons travaux.
Es pateicos Latvijas Universitātei par šo iespēju, kas ir dota ar šīs simpozijas starpniecību daudzvalodībai izpausties Latvijā, un novēlu jums visiem veiksmīgu darbu.
Paldies.
Ladies and gentlemen, Madame Wiebke Brahe, Cultural Attaché of the Embassy of Germany to Latvia, please.
Guten Morgen, sehr verehrte Gäste, vielen herzlichen Dank für die Einladung heute Morgen hier an die Universität, zu der ich sehr gern gekommen bin, um ein Grußwort zu sprechen. Denn Sprache ist ein Schlüssel zu einem Kulturraum, zu einem Informationsraum und zu Menschen. Meine Vorrednerin von der spanischen Botschaft hat schon über die spanische Sprache und mein Kollege von der französischen Botschaft hat schon über die französische Sprache gesprochen. Deutsch spielt hier in der Region, glaube ich, traditionell eine ganz wichtige Rolle. In Europa sprechen 100 Millionen Menschen Deutsch als Muttersprache. Und wenn man in der Muttersprache miteinander kommunizieren kann, dann berührt das mehr als nur das Verständnis, es berührt das Herz. Auch wenn es nicht so viele Menschen sind, die Deutsch als Muttersprache sprechen, wie Menschen, die Spanisch als Muttersprache sprechen, ist Deutsch doch diejenige Sprache, die am zweithäufigsten im Internet benutzt wird. Und das bedeutet, dass eben die Menschen, die Deutsch sprechen, erstens das Internet, dieses neue Medium, besonders nutzen und zweitens eben auch besonders viel schreiben in ihrer Sprache. Und das macht vielleicht die deutsche Sprache auch heute sehr, sehr interessant, weil man eben Zugang zu vielen Informationen über diese Sprache bekommen kann, die einem ohne diese Sprache verschlossen bleiben. Aber die heutige Konferenz geht ja nicht nur über die einzelnen Sprachen, sondern über die Kommunikation zwischen Sprachen. Die zunehmende Internationalisierung von Lebensverhältnissen führt dazu, dass wir mehr und mehr aufmerksam werden auf das Phänomen der Mehrsprachigkeit. Es ist gleichzeitig ein Beleg dafür, dass wir zusammenwachsen in Europa und in der Welt. Mehrsprachigkeit hilft, eine gemeinsame Sprache zu finden und Grenzen zu überwinden. Sie sind die Mittler in diesem Prozess. Und dafür möchte ich Ihnen ganz herzlich danken. Gerade in einem Beruf wie dem meinigen sind wir so oft auf Menschen angewiesen, die Sprache für uns vermitteln. Und es kann gar nicht hoch genug eingeschätzt werden, was ihre Arbeit ist. Beruflicher Erfolg und gesellschaftliche Teilnahme hängen heute zunehmend und mehr von Mehrsprachigkeit ab. Die Schaffung von entsprechenden Kompetenzen für Mehrsprachigkeit ist deshalb eine wichtige bildungspolitische Aufgabe und deshalb danke ich den Organisatoren und den Gästen für die Ausrichtung dieser wirklich wichtigen Konferenz und wünsche Ihnen allen viel Erfolg und neue Erkenntnisse aus Ihrem Zusammentreffen. Dankeschön.
I would like to give the floor now to Dr. Rainer Boots. head of the Department of Languages, Goethe Institute in Riga.
Excellencies, dear organizers of this conference, of this symposium, I would like to thank you very much for this opportunity to be here and have the opportunity to say a few words more in German after my colleague Wiebke Brahe said already something in my mother tongue. I will remember one speech of our famous writer Thomas Mann. He gave in 1949, and the title of this speech was Das Europäische auf Deutsch. What does it mean to be European, expressed in the German language? Diese Rede von Thomas Mann im Jahre 1949 hat er gehalten aus Anlass des 200. Geburtstages von Johann Wolfgang Goethe. Der Exilant Thomas Mann spricht 4 Jahre nach dem Ende des fürchterlichsten Krieges, den die Menschheit bis dahin gesehen hat und bis heute wohl gesehen hat, spricht über das Europäische auf Deutsch. Soweit ich das verstanden habe, es ist in Erinnerung geblieben mir diese Rede, und ich habe mich aus Anlass dieses Symposiums wieder daran erinnert. Ich denke, diese Rede hat 2 Richtungen. Oder hatte 2 Richtungen. Einmal nach Deutschland gerichtet, um den Deutschen zu sagen, erinnert euch an die europäische Dimension eurer Existenz. Diese Rede hatte auch eine andere Richtung, nach außen gerichtet. Es war die Botschaft, das andere Deutschland, das demokratische Deutschland, möchte gern wieder Teil sein der Völkerfamilie, der europäischen Völkerfamilie. Mit dieser Rede, mit diesem Thema war die Frage aufgeworfen, was ist denn das Europäische, das man auf Französisch, auf Deutsch, auf Spanisch, auf Polnisch, auf Bulgarisch und in all den anderen europäischen Sprachen zum Ausdruck bringen kann. Ich fühlte mich erinnert an diese Rede, weil heute wieder die Frage steht, Europa, was soll das sein? Seit einigen Jahren lesen und hören wir jeden Tag etwas über Krise, Eurokrise, Wirtschaftskrise, Bankenkrise und so weiter und so fort. Und es wird deutlich, dass die Frage, was ist Europa, was kann Europa sein, was soll Europa sein, wieder eine sehr aktuelle Frage ist. Für viele Menschen in ganz spezifischer Weise. Über diese Frage ist in Deutschland, in deutscher Sprache natürlich auch sehr viel nachgedacht worden und geschrieben worden. Und es wird deutlich, EU ist sehr viel mehr als nur eine Währungsunion oder nur eine politische Union, eine Wirtschaftsunion. Also solche Staaten wie Bulgarien, Rumänien, solche Völker wie Tschechien, Polen, Ungarn gehörten zu Europa. Da gab es die Europäische Union noch gar nicht. Die Frage steht also wieder neu, was soll Europa sein? Wie wollen wir in diesem Europa leben? Welche Stimme soll Europa in der Welt haben? Welche Werte vertritt Europa in der Welt, heute und in Zukunft? Das sind schwerwiegende Fragen. Für viele Menschen sind es Existenzfragen, weil sie verbunden sind mit der Frage, wo finde ich Arbeit, wo habe ich meinen Lebensmittelpunkt, wo ist meine Heimat, muss ich meine Heimat für eine bestimmte Zeit verlassen, habe ich Hoffnung, in die Heimat zurückzukehren, wie ist es mit der Heimat Europa? Wer wissen möchte, was in Deutschland und auf Deutsch zu diesem Thema gedacht und geschrieben wird, sollte Deutsch lernen. Ich weiß, viele Konferenzen finden heute auf Englisch statt, viele Veröffentlichungen erfolgen in Englisch und das ist auch gut so. Aber diese Konferenz, und das finde ich eben sehr, sehr gut, bemerkenswert und beispielhaft an die Adresse der Organisatoren gerichtet, ich finde es beispielhaft, dass wir Mehrsprachigkeit, Frau Brahe hat davon gesprochen, Mehrsprachigkeit praktizieren. Das ist ein ganz wichtiger bildungspolitischer und pädagogischer Impuls. Wir sollten darauf bestehen, es uns nicht so leicht zu machen und immer nur zu sagen, Englisch reicht oder irgendeine beliebige andere Sprache reicht. Wir wissen sehr genau, jede Sprache ist ein spezifischer Zugang zur Welt. Wer wissen möchte, wie dieser spezifische Zugang zur Welt durch die deutsche Optik, durch die deutsche Sprache erfolgt, muss sich mit ihr beschäftigen, sollte sich mit ihr beschäftigen. Wenn Sie das tun wollen, können Sie das gerne im Goethe-Institut tun. Ich stehe hier als Vertreter des Goethe-Instituts. Sie wissen, wir haben hier in Riga ein sehr schönes Haus. Ich würde mich freuen, wenn ich die einen oder anderen von Ihnen als Gast begrüßen dürfte. Ich freue mich, dass dieses Symposium stattfindet, wünsche ihm gutes Gelingen und viele neue Kontakte, viele neue Verbindungen, viele neue Ideen für weitere Zusammenkünfte. Herzlichen Dank, auf gutes Gelingen. Danke.
I wish to thank all the speakers today so far for the wishes of success for this second international symposium that concentrates on language for international communication to link interdisciplinary perspectives. And while the magic of the words of wishes for success are still here in the air, I wish to proceed and give the floor to our keynote speakers. And also there is a note of warning that each keynote speaker today has 25 minutes to develop and round up the topic, whilst people in the audience have 5 minutes to ask their questions and get the answers. With this, I would like to introduce the first keynote speaker. It is Associate Professor Terry McCarthy. She is originally from the United States, recently now residing in Lithuania, and the topic of her report is Language and Humanity. Is it more than mere instinct? Welcome.
Good morning. It's lovely to see you this morning. I'm very excited to be here, and I want to thank you very much for the invitation and all of the logistics and coordinating for this conference. I would like to start with a story. Helen Keller was born in 1880. She was born with exceptional intelligence. However, she contracted scarlet fever at 19 months, and this left her both deaf and blind. With only a few simple signs that she herself invented to communicate with her parents, this would mean mother, the rubbing of her cheek, Helen was isolated from the world. The little girl eventually became uncontrollable. Fits of temper, irritable tantrums, and her strong will kept the Keller home in constant turmoil. Helen's mother read an article about Perkins School for the Blind in Massachusetts, USA. And out of desperation, the Kellers wrote to Perkins School for the Blind and asked if they might send Helen a teacher. Annie Sullivan was selected as Keller's governess and teacher. Annie Sullivan had been raised in an orphanage. She was suffering from loss of sight herself, and she was a very determined young woman brought up in poverty to overcome that poverty through education. At 21, Sullivan had instinctively developed her own methods of teaching. First, she separated Helen from her overprotective, indulgent parents
and moved with her to an isolated cottage. Sullivan was a firm disciplinarian, and she used American Sign Language from the very first day with Helen and spelled words into Helen's hands. She constantly named whatever drew the little girl's attention, just as one would with a pre-verbal hearing child. She believed that Helen would learn through repetition and context. In fact, Sullivan's techniques are still used in education of the deaf and blind today. After about just 5 weeks, Anne Sullivan's work with Helen Keller paid off. Helen Keller was finally able to connect the sensation of water running over her hands with that spelled out, W-A-T-E-R, in her other hand. And suddenly, Helen understood that everything had a name and that there was a system of language that she could use to communicate. Keller wrote in her autobiography, "I was like a ship without compass. I had no way of knowing how near the harbor was. Light, give me light, was the wordless cry of my soul. And suddenly I felt a misty consciousness as if something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought. And somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew that W-A-T-E-R meant the wonderful, cool something that was flowing over my hand. That living word awakened my soul and gave it light, hope, joy, and set it free." Helen Keller learned over 600 words that day. She went on to publish 12 books and dozens of articles. She was only 6 years old when she first was introduced to language. And yet she was able to learn 5 languages, English, French, German, Greek, and Latin. Helen Keller traveled to over 39 nations. And in 1904, at 24 years of age, Helen Keller graduated from Radcliffe University, becoming the first deaf-blind person to ever earn a bachelor's degree. So, you're asking the question, what does a deaf-blind American girl born over 100 years ago have to do with a language symposium on language for international communication? Right? Well, I want to come back and explain this, but keep it in your mind. Just focus on the forbidden experiment. I'll come back to that. Okay. I believe that language is the common condition of the human species. As Tabor says, we live in the house of language. No group of people nor tribe has ever been discovered that did not have a highly complex and highly developed language system, regardless of their linguistic differences. Darwin said, "There is no such thing as a simple language. All languages are complex." I believe that language is innate. And part of my education or research or study of the innate ability to speak and to know language comes from Steven Pinker. How many of you are familiar with Steven Pinker, the language instinct? He coined the term language instinct back in 1994. It's a Chomskyan-based theory, and this is Pinker's basic premise. Language is not a cultural artifact that we learn the way we learn to tell time. It is a distinct piece of the biological makeup of our brains, and for these reasons, cognitive scientists have described language as a mental organ, a neural system, a computational module. Language instinct theory is generative-based theory that presupposes neurophysiological reality for language. The LI theory states that much of the complex structures of human language is encoded in the human genetic inheritance. And I believe the research gives strong evidence that there is an inborn instinct. And I believe that language instinct should have an impact on us as language educators, as researchers, as lovers of language, as philologists. Just to associate with some of the terminology, the language instinct theory is very closely related to universal grammar, language innateness, language universals, the critical period hypothesis, computation for human language, FOXP2 gene, and generative grammar and generative linguistics. So here's how we might look at the language instinct theory. The brain is the computer, the language instinct is the operating system, and the language, whether it be Chinese or Latvian or Lithuanian or German, is the software program that has to have information inserted. But the operating system is already in place. But it does have its critics. Sampson from University of Sussex says language is learned behavior, merely learned behavior, the way you would learn an instrument, the way you would learn how to walk, the way a child learns how to play ball or basketball. Michael Tomasello from Emory University says language is cognitively and functionally explained. And Stephen Crowley from South Africa says language instinct theory is neither scientific nor empirically based. Harley, who's written an entire book trying to denounce the language instinct, says language is simply a psychological development of process. And Daniel Everett from Massachusetts, language is a hominid-made tool, an instrument for survival. Arguments against this instinct are based, they say language instinct theory is based on rationalism. It's not based on being able to find it and research it and touch it and taste it and to do mathematical equations about it. There's no empirical evidence for language instinct theory. It has no falsifiability. Its language is culturally transmitted. Language universals are myth. There are no universals in language. Language instinct theory is not based on the study of human behavior. It's not based on what we know, what we can see, what we can prove. Language is a tool or an instrument created by man. So if language theory must pass these tests, then how do we as scientists, researchers, teachers, educators, how do we explain creative imagination, emotional complexity, music, art, abstract thinking, instincts such as survival and building? I'm left-handed. The whole world is backward to me, being a left-handed person. If you tell me to turn right, I will instinctively turn left. I'm wired that way. Those are my instincts, being a left-handed person. Sir Bernard Levell, who died just last year, was a renowned scientist from the UK. He says, I'm no more surprised or distressed at the limitation of science when faced with this great problem of creation than I am at the limitation of the spectroscope in describing the radiance of a sunset, or at the theory of counterpoint in describing the beauty of a fugue. There are limitations to science. We know that. We understand that. And I think that within that limitation of science, we have to embrace rational arguments. We have to embrace what we consider a logical setup for the language instinct. But our world has changed. And what we know now about the language instinct, we didn't know 15 to 20 years ago. Science has improved how we understand the brain and how language works in our brain. Kathy Price from University College London now works with brain imaging and brain scanning. She works mostly with people who have had language impairment due to strokes. She's able to isolate where verbs are found, where nouns are found. She's able to isolate in the brain through scanning and imagery from the brain how language is operating while someone's trying to speak. Gary Morgan from City University of London, he has done a 10-year study on a language savant. His study is for Christopher Taylor, who is an autistic savant who cannot tie his shoes. And yet he speaks more than 20 languages fluently and can learn a foreign language, basics of a foreign language, in about 10 minutes. Tecumseh Fitch has isolated the fact that for years we believed that language was unique to the human race because of our vocal system, because we had an apparatus that no other mammal had, the apparatus that allowed us to speak. But now through X-ray machine and the study of other mammals, we've learned that that is not true. Fitch has said that the only thing that we can understand from looking at the vocal apparatus of all other mammals is that language is only in the human brain. And Pfeiffer from Columbia University has been studying language in children, in infants, from the day that they're born. He does imaging from them on electrodes. I want you to see. This is his cap he invented. And when a baby is 1 day old, he puts the cap on this child, and they begin to produce language. Language from computers, language from strangers, and language from the mother. When the mother's voice is heard by the infant, the heart rate increases, and you can see the brain waves increase. Pfeiffer believes that language begins in utero, in the mother's womb. So these new technologies and this research let us see more clearly the innateness of language in the human brain. Now we have been able to isolate it from the DNA to a genetic FOXP2. If there are abnormalities or deformities in the FOXP2 section gene of the DNA, then language is deformed and language is abnormal. So the MRIs, brain scanning, new studies in adult brain injuries, we can now, through neuron receptors, measure when a child is able to recognize language. There's no getting around it. I believe the research and the literature shows that there is literally a language instinct in our DNA. So why does it matter? Back to Helen Keller. What does a deaf-blind girl born 100 years ago in America have to do with a symposium on language for international communication here in Riga? Keller is the forbidden experiment. By forbidden experiment, we're describing that we cannot raise a child in isolation. We believe that it's not only cruel, it's inhumane, it's unethical, it's immoral. But she had been created in her own isolation because she could not hear, she could not see, and she was isolated in a world of her own until she was 6 years old. But in Helen and her life and her understanding of what happened in her life after she learned language, we see that there was an innate component in her brain, her mind, her soul, to communicate. She longed to communicate. And once that was activated, she learned 600 new words just that day. She learned 5 languages. She was able to graduate from university, neither seeing nor hearing, but with that language instinct tapped into, her entire world and her learning world was revolutionized. Opponents say that language is a tool, language is an instrument, language is man-made invention solely for the purpose of survival. Language is simply learned behavior, the way you learn to ride a bike or swim. But I think it's wrong, and I think it's ignoring research to reduce language to a mere mechanism or instrument. If it is simply learned, then how does language change? And more importantly, how does it remain the same? It's the use of it that should be deforming it, reforming it. And often we can find language that has not changed in thousands of years. Language is highly complex. It is so complex that we don't even have the language necessary to describe it here today, not exhaustively. If language was simply learned, as culture is learned, or the way we learn to tell time or do math or ride a bike, then how do we explain sentences we speak every day that we've never heard before? If language is just repetition, then we should only be able to speak to one another in things that someone taught us before. But we're constantly creating, inventing, and speaking sentences. This day, in this conference, you will say a sentence that no one has ever said before in history. That's the uniqueness of the language instinct. From the play from Neil Simon, Albert says, "So, are you saying that you were the best friend of the woman who was married to the man who represented your husband in the divorce?" Andre says, "In the entire history of mankind, that sentence has never been spoken before." We have a 3-year-old grandson. His name is Jack. I love watching language come from Jack as he processes it. He is an English speaker. And when Jack comes to visit our house, he likes to swim in the community pool. We have very hot summers in Kansas. And when he comes back from the pool with his papa, he comes in and he says, "Mimi, Papa and I swimmed." Jack, at 3 years old, has never heard anyone in our family say swimmed. And I can tell you that no one in our community speaks this way. All of Jack's family have university education, are well-read, and understand how to conjugate the irregular verb. But Jack is trying to conjugate the verb according to his universal grammar, his grammar instinct. He doesn't know that swim is irregular. Unfortunately for poor Jack, he is in a language that's filled with irregularities. If English wasn't irregular, Jack would be spot on. And what about those language universals that all of the opponents say do not exist? In my research in the last 2 years, there are over 600 specific language items found in every known language in our world. Things like a word for mom, a word for dad, word for sister, word for brother, word for food, word for air. Even colors, primary colors, are found in every language. Now, there's some difficulty with things like pink and orange, yes. But red, blue, and green exist in every language. And those are the ones that are specific. If we go out of the specificity and look at variations, there are over 2,000 language universals. These are always different according to culture, but they are in those languages. And if languages are man-made, if they are just a tool, then why work so hard to preserve endangered languages? If they are obsolete, so what? Like the horse and carriage, they've outlived their usefulness. One of the reasons we want to preserve languages, I live in a country where we have a minority language, only 3 million probably population of Lithuania, and we struggle constantly in the preservation of the Lithuanian language. Why preserve a language? Why not let it die if it's just a tool? Because language is identity. Language is who we are. It expresses our personalities, our beliefs. It is the revelation of our soul, our mind, our hearts, our thinking, our imagination, our creativity. I think language makes us human. And to deny that it is innately in us and a part of our organic makeup is to deny what it means to be human. The innateness of language preserves the beauty, mystery, and miraculous nature of language. Language innate theory forces us to revere language the way we revere a beating heart or the sound of a beautiful voice. Language instinct theory allows our human existence to celebrate all of creation and the elegant design of who we are and this universe in which we live. It is an admission that our makeup is more than mere matter. We are more than mere matter. For any of us that have ever held a baby in our arms for the first time and struggled to express the beauty, the love, the warmth, for any of us who've stood at the deathbed of a relative, a grandmother, a loved one, we find it difficult to say that language is just a tool. It's a way for us to lament. It's a way for us to praise. It's a way for us to complain. It's a way for us to emotionally express as well as scientifically express the innermost thoughts and workings of the brain. Bottom line, I'm a teacher. I've got 5 minutes? Okay, watch me closely. Moravian scholar Jan Amos Komenius says, languages are the means by which we may acquire knowledge and may impart it to others, for it is human beings we are preparing, not parrots. Kenneth Pike says, language directs and guides. Language should be used to help people express their personalities. Language identifies person. Language identifies us. Language concentrates lives, memories, truths, and joys. It expresses them and guides them and concentrates them. Words are like that. David Smith, starting after all from the premise that our students are not machines, not docile information processing mechanisms, but living images constantly shaping, reshaping, and reshaping themselves. As Helen Keller expressed it, that living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, set it free. The innateness of language says it's part of the human process, part of the human makeup, that soul, beauty, heart, and mind, passion, and expression are okay for us because we didn't invent them, they are part of us. So here, basically, why the issues of language instinct are significant. One, it changes our worldview. How we view ourselves, how we view education, how we view our students, all of that is wrapped up in how we view language. That it's no longer just a mechanism, it's no longer just a tool, but it is something that is a part of our very being. It's a way of honoring our humanness, our being people and persons. Here's why I believe language instinct is correct. Science now proves that there is a genetic link to language in our DNA. It's descriptive, yes, but it's also inexplicable. And how should it change? What kind of a change should it make? And what kind of difference in the way we teach? It allows us to see that language is a human endeavor. Because we're not educating parrots. We're educating human beings, and we must engage them, heart, mind, body, and spirit. We must allow students to see the beauty and wonder of language. We must help them see it, that it is connected to their lives, that language has meaning and purpose for each of them. Language is not commonplace. It is powerful, it is beautiful, it is effective, it is terrible, it is magical, it is enduring. It is our identity as the human race. Language is the human miracle. And as we enter this conference over the next 2 days, where we'll be discussing language, investigating language, I hope that we will have a wonderful sense of awe of the miracle of language. And Helen Keller's relating to us in this conference is to remind us that each one of us, as we speak, as we communicate, as we present, as we discuss ideas, we are allowing one another an insight, a view into the human soul. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor McCarthy. Thank you very much. Welcome. If you have questions, now it's the time. I shall approach you with the microphone.
I have an email address if any of you would like to have my paper, my full paper, and this PowerPoint presentation. I also have done research with students on their belief system about innateness of language and how it will impact their teaching. So if you want any of this information, let me know. I'll email it to you.
Dear Terry, I wish so much, with all my heart, you were right. But how can you answer the question? For example, you mentioned Simon Kirby from the University of Edinburgh, who works with artificial intelligence creatures. And they also develop language, the same way as humans. I was a witness. I saw it. How can you explain?
But actually it can't. Artificial intelligence has come a long way, and I love the way I think computational linguistics is the future. I tell my students, if you're going to graduate school, study computational linguistics. That's where the money is. But one of the things about artificial intelligence is it cannot respond to the uniqueness and oddities of language, the way you and I can. It also cannot originate original thought. It's impossible. What goes in has to come out. But, they've made great progress. But I don't believe we will ever be able to duplicate the beauty, organic nature of language. It's about psyche. It's about, we can say emotions. It's about creativity. I think creativity would be maybe more correct.
Yes, good morning. According to you, what is the difference between Helen Keller, who was isolating herself, as you said, and finally learned language, and the so-called wolf children, like, say, Caspar Hauser, that kind, who were were isolated from mankind as well until a certain age, but never learned language. So what about the language instinct in their case?
Well, first of all, there's still doubts about wolf children. But I think we need to take what we know rather than a hypothetical situation. Because if you look at the young girl Olga, who was raised by dogs, and I don't know if you've ever seen the documentary on Olga, the dog girl, but she was raised by dogs, and she was able immediately to tap into language. Now, she was exposed, maybe as an infant, to some language, but she was put with dogs, and that's how she survived. Have any of you seen Olga, the dog girl? Okay. If you email me, I'll send you the link for that. It's out of the Russia. So here's the thing. I don't know that wolf children have ever really been proved. Every time we think we have a child that's raised by wolf or raised in isolation, we come to find out there's something artificial, phony, a little bit scamish about that. Helen is one that we know is not. And we also know from her extensive writing that in her was a desire to communicate. And once it was tapped into, it was nonstop. There were nights that she wouldn't sleep just to learn. Annie Sullivan, her teacher, could not keep up with this desire, this thirst, this hunger for language. Now, I do have challenges that after usually 12 years of age, once a human being enters puberty, there does seem to be a closed window on developing correct language. It has something to do with the cortex firming up or hormones. But wolf children are still a challenge. If I ever find a study with a wolf child that is authentic, I will definitely delve into that. But good question.
More questions? Seems no more questions,
Okay.
Terry. Thank
Thank
you
you.
once again. Thank you.
you very much.
It is my pleasure, indeed, to give the floor to Associate Professor Indra Karapetjana, who is also the head of the Department of English Studies, Faculty of Humanities, University of Latvia. She also is the director of the Center for Applied Linguistics.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, students. First of all, let me thank you all for being here. I'm really very pleased that so many of you could come today from different countries. I know that it's a very, very busy time of the year for many of you. Therefore, I really, we all, the organizers of this event, appreciate this very much. Well, I also have a story for you, but not that serious as Terry's story. I came across it when reading an article about the use of language in diplomacy, and well, the story by Stanko Nick is as follows. It is an old story which says that one should use many languages to be properly understood. Speaking to God, Latin, to the military, German, to the merchants, Greek and Arabic, to the musicians, Italian, to his cook, Chinese, to the sailors and engineers, English, to the artists, Russian, to friends, Spanish, to enemies, Dutch or Hungarian, to his girlfriend, French, to his wife, Japanese. Well, this is very much about this conference, a language for international communication. This story shows us how many roles we may play in our lives and, in fact, how many languages we may need to know to be able to communicate successfully in different fields. Which leads us to the main question of my presentation, which actually is done together with my colleague Gunta Roziņa, Associate Professor. In our presentation today, we are going to deal with three main issues. So we'll start with placing applied linguistics in Latvian in global and historical context. Then we'll look at scope and definition afterwards at the end of our presentation to propose our own definition of applied linguistics, defining also its scope. I will tell you about applied linguistics in Latvia, and finally we will draw conclusions. Now let's turn to the first part of our presentation, that is applied linguistics, in its global and historical context. Although applied linguistics appears to be a relatively recent term, this field of linguistics has grown quickly and now is really flourishing with academic positions, academic institutions, centers, departments, also journals, associations all around the world, including Latvia. The origins of applied linguistics are rooted in the second half of the previous century. The term was applied to the new academic discipline of the study of the teaching and learning of second and foreign languages in the late 1940s and 1950s in Britain and the USA. The journal Language Learning, first issued in 1948, had a subtitle, A Quarterly Journal of Applied Linguistics, which in fact is considered to be the beginning of applied linguistics. The term applied linguistics was used not only to refer to academic studies, but also to university institutions, for example, School of Applied Linguistics at Edinburgh University, Scotland, founded in 1957. Of course, this was followed by university departments of applied linguistics and language centers in different higher education institutions. At that time, actually, as Trim explains, it was largely to provide professionalization of the teaching of English as a foreign language, which the British Council considered to be necessary in the national interest and partly due to the post-war situation, need to promote foreign language learning in the UK itself. As Grabe writes, in the 1950s, the term reflected the insights of structural and functional linguistics, and that could be applied to second language teaching and also to first language literacy. In the 1960s, the term was used to refer to the application of linguistics to language teaching. During the late 1950s, and the early 1960s, applied linguistics was gradually broadened to what was then referred as automatic translation. In the 1960s, interestingly, we find that it started dealing with language assessment, language policies, second language acquisition, shifting attention to learning rather than teaching. This is what I would like to emphasize here. Despite the fact that the broadening of applied linguistics continued, it was largely taken for granted also in the 1960s and 1970s that applied linguistics was about language teaching. In 1964, the International Association of Applied Linguistics was founded, and it's interesting again to note that actually first international association was founded, and only afterwards national foundations and associations sprouted all over the world. So the British Association of Applied Linguistics was established in 1967. There was initial debate about its scope. Should it concern primarily and exclusively with the matters to do with language teaching and machine translation? However, a broader perspective was agreed on, and in the version of the Constitution, in the 1974 version of the Constitution, the aims of the association were defined as the study of language use, language acquisition, fostering of interdisciplinary collaboration in this field was emphasized. So going now to the next important moment in the development of applied linguistics. So the American Association for Applied Linguistics, founded in 1977, have defined the fields of applied linguistics, and you see this field becomes broader. So first of all, these are language-related concerns, including language education, acquisition and loss, bilingualism, discourse analysis, literacy, second foreign language pedagogy, and so on. Actually, the association's mission is to employ various theoretical frameworks and methodological approaches to deal with language-related problems, as you could also see from this list. So the mission was and still is to facilitate the advancement and dissemination of knowledge and understanding regarding these language-related issues, well, in order to improve the lives and individual and conditions in society. So at that point, it was also emphasized that applied linguistics is an interdisciplinary field of inquiry, as it draws on a range of various theoretical, methodological, and educational approaches from various disciplines. And so Grabe mentions 4 consequences resulting from the claim that applied linguistics is driven, first by real-world problems rather than theories, and 2 of them being as follows. So recognizing local context for exploration, including needs analysis, thus following variable solutions in different local contexts. Secondly, language is seen as functional and discourse-based, thus resorting to systemic and descriptive linguistics for problem solving. So these were considered to be successful approaches for the analysis of data in real-world context. As Grabe claims, one of the most important developments has been the appearance of register and genre analysis due to their application in a variety of language use situations. And, as you could see here in this slide, he emphasizes, discourse, register, and genre analysis, and these being hallmarks of much applied linguistics research. In the 1980s, applied linguistics already comprised translation, lexicography, multilingualism, language and technology, corpus linguistics. By the end, just one more point, in 1980s, the journal Applied Linguistics appeared, and it has been published successfully all this time, and also serves as a proof for the scope of applied linguistics. So by the end of the 1980s, beginning of 90s, applied linguistics drew on supporting disciplines such as psychology, education, anthropology, and other sciences. Thus, we have shown how applied linguistics as a field has developed over all these years in the world. And now let's move to the next point, which is a reflection on more recent understanding of applied linguistics, and also giving definition and scope and its scope. Unfortunately, the lack of consensus of what is regarded as applied linguistics still exists. To quote a well-known definition of applied linguistics, it says that it's the theoretical and empirical investigation of real-world problems in which language is a central issue. So I would like to, repeat once again that traditionally the primary concerns of applied linguistics have been second language acquisition theory, also second language pedagogy, and also the interface between two. But if you look at, the next definition, we see that this initial definition of applied linguistics has been really broadened and refined, and this one says that applied linguistics is using what we know about language, how it is learned, how it is used in order to achieve some purpose or solve some problem in the real world. I would like next to give an insight into the scope of applied linguistics as suggested by Cook. And so first of all, it is language and education, which implies first, second, and foreign language education. Then The next one is language, work, and law. Workplace communication, which would be, well, the study of how language is used in the workplace and how it contributes to the nature and power relations of different types of work, and also considering different hierarchical relationships that exist at work. It's also about language planning, so making decisions often supported by legislation about the official status of languages and their institutional use, including their use in education. Also forensic linguistics, which is development of linguistic evidence in criminal and legal investigations. Then the next one would be language information and effect, and here critical discourse analysis is mentioned as a study of the relationship between linguistic choices and effects in persuasive uses of language, how, for example, one can manipulate with the help of language, well, the audience that, let's say, discourse is aimed at. So then it also implies translation and interpretation, the formation of principles underlying the perceived equivalence between, let's say, stretch of language and its translation, and the practice of translating written text and interpreting spoken language. Well, interesting information design, which would be arrangement and presentation of written language. And, here the last one is lexicography, so the planning and compiling of both monolingual and bilingual dictionaries as defined by Cook. In practice, however, some areas, such as translation studies, are regarded as independent disciplines, which is the case in Latvia. So in the science classification of the Latvian Council of Science, comparative and contrastive linguistics is a branch of linguistics independent of applied linguistics. Thus, what can be concluded so far is that linguistics, it seems, must play an important role in applied linguistics, but by no means the only role. Applied linguistics must also draw on psychology, sociology, education, and so on. And formal linguistics takes a supportive role. Applied linguistics is often said to be concerned with solving or at least improving social problems involving language. So we might ask different kind of questions. For example, what advice can we offer a Minister of Education and Science regarding the Year 12 examination or accreditation issues? How can the acquisition of languages for specific purposes, or Latvian as a foreign language, be fostered? How can we improve the training of translators and interpreters? How can we evaluate a school program? This breadth is abundantly clear from the range of topics addressed in applied linguistics conferences or journals covered by applied linguistics, also master's degree programs and doctoral programs. So just to round up this part, well, the scope is quite broad, and well, among the fields to be mentioned might be discourse analysis, pragmatics, language planning and policy, well, language for specific purposes, multimodal communication, etc. Now let's move to the final and most, well, essential part of our presentation, and this would be applied linguistics in Latvia. So, describing the historical context of applied linguistics in Latvia, we can see a gradual move away from the central focus on linguistics. First, of course, we can say that a significant amount of work directed to real-world problems or issues involving language can be attributed to linguistics, although not characterized as applied linguistics at that time. Over many years of linguistics being mainstream, applied linguistics also gradually has become prominent. So Latvian applied linguistics has evolved over time in its orientation and scope. As Professor Raiņa writes, it would be wrong to state that applied linguistics was non-existent in Latvia before 1999. It did develop, but only under the disguise of other scholarly activities and branches of other sciences. So much of what can now be seen as applied linguistics type activity was carried out prior to the formal appearance of applied linguistics in the year 1999, when it was officially entered into the science classification of the Latvian Council of Science as a field of linguistics. So here's a definition of applied linguistics. So we can see that it deals with a theoretical foundation for practical activities in the field of language use, teaching, and so on. But now, since the scope of applied linguistics was not defined before 1999, there were certain problems of formally recognizing the conducted research. So I would like to mention that since the year 2000, the sub-program of applied linguistics has been offered within the doctoral program in linguistics at the University of Latvia, and also since the year 2011, there's a program which also has a subfield, applied linguistics, offered by two partner universities, Ventspils University College and Lielajā University. So since that time, well, actually 1999, we can say that applied linguistics in Latvia has undergone, well, broadening in its scope and now contributes to promote the language in use and also fostering disciplinary collaboration. How much time have I got? Thank you. It's true that language acquisition has been dominant in applied linguistics in Latvia. That is, more applied linguists specialize in this field than in any other. However, what applied linguistics offers is a recognition that the question to ask is not how to improve the learning, but what is it that is not being improved? In other words, what is that is supposed to be being learned? So I'd like to mention that discourse analysis has emerged as a need to see language as functional discourse-based and to recognize and address locally situated language problems. Also, the genre analysis and register analysis as part of discourse analysis have arisen out of this development in the scope of, well, the fields of applied linguistics. So, I would like to mention some doctoral theses developed, and the first one by Gunter Raiņa can be considered in a way a breakthrough in Latvia because it dealt with language use in professional settings, in particular the genre of annual reports. I mean breakthrough in terms of, well, thesis written in applied linguistics and also written in the English language. So it was followed by Karapetjana, and well, this particular thesis employed widely the notions discourse analysis, register and genre. Then the next one I would like to mention is by two colleagues, Tsigankova and Vincela. And well, these dissertations moved a step forward by analyzing language use using corpus linguistics tools. Well, let's say the novelty of Vincela's research lies in the fact that the methodology of the multi-dimensional analysis of discourse proposed by Biber has been first applied in the investigation of electronic texts composed by students who are non-native speakers of English. In her thesis, Natalia Tsigankova has distinguished a new type of English discourse, computer-mediated academic discourse, and proposed its original conceptual definition. Quite recently, Laura Karpinska, in her thesis, has done a comprehensive diachronic review of the whole English-Latvian lexicographic tradition with a special focus on the analysis of the dictionaries on all structural levels. So I would say that currently there is a strong emphasis on discourse analysis as a study of language language use in academic, well, professional context. And so the research interests lie within a realm of political, business, technology, legal, cross-cultural communication, and electronic discourse analysis. Discourse analysis is also applied in the areas related to language and education, which includes both language as a means and language as a goal of education. We also have a number of doctoral students majoring in applied linguistics. So to mention some, Jana Kuzmina deals with IT professional discourse, Maļavska deals with academic business discourse, Gorelkina, advertising discourse, and so on. So we can see that the scope is really broad, and dissertations have examined the ways in which language is used in these different contextual settings. Pragmatics is an emerging subfield of applied linguistics, and currently the University of Latvia is the only academic institution that conducts theoretical and empirical research in applied and general pragmatics. Again, maybe I'd like to mention Yekaterina Černiavska, who is doing her PhD thesis related to pragmatics in engineering, which again we see this contextual application. And so we have also founded Center for Applied Linguistics, and it has been established with the aim to promote research activities in applied linguistics, not only in the English language, but also in Spanish, French, and German, in various professional fields. So, in fact, the conference program testifies to the expansion of applied linguistics, and here I have, copied some of the presentation that we are going to listen today. And so translation, terminology and translation would be one field. So, this continues. We also see that here are not only, presentations, reports in the English language, but also German, as by Ieva Sprode, and Spanish, Alla Placinska, for example. Then the next broad field of applied linguistics would be discourse analysis, pragmatics, and corpus linguistics. So we have a number of representatives here. So it still goes on. Then lexicography and lexicology do not seem to be that widely presented. Nevertheless, they are very important, let's say, fields in applied linguistics. The broadest one, which is not surprising at all, would be the subfield language acquisition, competences, and testing. So I would like to mention some colleagues from the Turība University by, presentations by Ineta Abola, then also Šubņikova Nadezhda from Maritime Academy, I hope I'm right, and also here we see Abasheva and Kuzmenko presentations from Transport and Telecommunications Institute in Riga. And also our Spanish colleagues here presenting reports on applied linguistics. So in this remit, language acquisition is but one of many areas of inquiry. It has certainly not disappeared from applied linguistics, far from it, but it is now one area, even if still the biggest among equals. This is what I wanted to emphasize. Just getting now to conclusions. Our definition of applied linguistics would be as follows, that applied linguistics is a theoretical and practice-driven discipline that addresses solving language-related phenomena in a variety of general, academic, occupational, and professional contexts in which the language in use is a core issue of investigation. So we also would like to claim the interdisciplinary nature of applied linguistics, and so definitely it cannot exist without other disciplines, and so it's This interdisciplinary nature can be appropriately evaluated if it is considered within the scope of other fields like economics, law, medicine, diplomacy, and so on, in which the language serves as an instrument of communication. And what we'd like to emphasize is that applied linguistics is an autonomous area of inquiry distinct from pedagogy, but at the same time it employs relevant notions of pedagogical methodology to, well, investigate really important issues related to language acquisition. So, and we would also like to propose, well, our academy, our Council of Science to reconsider the science classification of regarding applied linguistics by broadening actually and verifying its scope. So the original definition is in white, but we would also like to add some additional subfields of applied linguistics. Well, this brings me to the end of my presentation, and I'm really sorry that I have overused the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Karapetiana. Questions, please? Are there any questions?
Said everything possible.
Applied linguistics.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now I'm very glad, yes, please, to give the floor to Professor Wolfgang Lörscher. He represents here our friendly University of Leipzig, with whom we are in a friendly Erasmus embrace. Professor Lörscher is also Dean of the Faculty of Philology. His special area of research interest is psycholinguistics, and he's going to give us an insight into historical and systematic issues of this sphere. You're welcome.
Thank you very much for these friendly words of introduction. Dear colleagues, students, it's a great pleasure to be here in Riga and to be able to talk to you in this very interesting conference. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. So what I would like to present to you today is a brief overview of some aspects of psycholinguistics, as has already been mentioned, systematic and historical aspects. So let me start with a few introductory remarks on psycholinguistics. This discipline is of rather recent origin in comparison to, let's say, semantics or syntax, even morphology. It's not a very old discipline in linguistics. It originated in the late 50s of the last century, and it's specifically related to the two Americans, Osgood and Šebek. Šebek actually is an American of Hungarian origin, and Charles Osgood, a famous psycholinguist in the United States. In the late 1950s, we can see that the then predominant view of language was behaviorist. Behaviorism is a particular concept in psychology. It originated at the beginning of the last century, but then it came into discredit, and only in the 50s, especially towards the beginning of the 50s, it became an important paradigm in psychology again. Basically, we can say that behaviorism maintains that behavior and actions can be described and interpreted within a framework of stimulus and response. So all our behavior, all our actions are caused by particular stimuli, or they are the result of particular stimuli. This model was actually developed on the basis of animal behavior. Not only animal behavior, but also animal behavior in particular laboratory situations. So, for instance, certain findings were certain experiments were carried out with rats in a maze. This is quite an artificial surroundings for these animals, but nonetheless, certain insights were made on the basis of this. So we actually have a twofold reduction here in this model, which was applied to human behavior. First, we have the reduction that it was developed on the basis of animal behavior, and secondly, that it was not based on animal behavior in their natural habitats, but in particular laboratory situations. In the United States, it was basically the psychologist or behaviorist Skinner and the linguist Bloomfield who claimed that our language, or they said language behavior, can also be described and explained within the model of stimulus response. Here, however, the model is more complex. So it looks like this. We see that there's a combination of nonverbal and verbal stimuli and responses. So I can explain this model by means of a particular example. So S capital stands for nonverbal stimulus, R small stands for verbal response. So let's imagine the following situation. There are two people, Jack and Jill, who go for a walk, and all of a sudden Jill sees a beautiful tree on an apple. So this apple would be the nonverbal stimulus for Jill. And as a result of this stimulus, she asks Jack, "Oh, could you please go and get me this apple?" So this then is the verbal response to the nonverbal stimulus. This verbal response acts at the same time as a nonverbal stimulus for Jack. So Jack jumps the fence, picks the apple, and puts it into the hands of Jill, which then is the nonverbal response to the verbal stimulus. So we see here a combination and an interaction of verbal and nonverbal stimuli and responses. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this diagram. We have the stimulus, then we have the black box, that's our brain, and we have a response. The problem, however, was that only S, stimulus, and R can be directly observed and investigated. There is no way of looking into the brain. And I mean, even if we opened the skull of a person and would see the brain underneath, we wouldn't really see any processes going on there. So at that time, there was no methodology at all in order to investigate what goes on in the mind of a person. In other words, the processes within the black box are not open to scientific investigation, and as a result of this, no speculations about what happens inside the black box were made. I would also like to remind you, this was in the 50s. That was at a time when linguistics was just developing into a sort of accepted scientific field in the fields of sciences. So, and this actually meant that no speculations about what happens inside the black box were made. Obviously, there are quite a few problems connected with this whole approach, and these problems actually led to a new approach, which was psycholinguistics. Let me mention three problems here. The first one is stimulus generalization. That means many different stimuli can evoke the same response. So, for instance, we are frightened. This could be a response to very many stimuli, not just to one, but to very many. So there is no sort of relationship of a discrete kind between a stimulus and a response. The second problem is response generalization. This means that the same response can evoke many different reactions. Well, obviously, for example, I can say, if I were you, I wouldn't go there. This particular stimulus can actually lead to very many different responses. The person addressed could, for instance, understand this as a friendly advice. She or he could also understand it as a threat or just as some sort of information. So you see there's no discrete relation between a stimulus and a response. And this is probably the biggest problem of all. There's no explanation why and how a particular stimulus evokes a particular response. Now, none of these problems, and very many others as well, could be solved within the framework of behaviorism. And as a result of this, psycholinguistics as a mentalist discipline was born. So mentalist actually means that it is specifically devoted to the investigation of the mental processes, that is, the processes which go on in the black box in our brain. This, to my mind, is quite a good definition of psycholinguistics, which goes back to Alan Garnham, a psycholinguist in the United Kingdom. He actually gave this definition in the 80s, but still I haven't found a better one. So I use this here. It says, psycholinguistics is the study of the mental mechanisms that make it possible for people to use language. Okay, mental mechanisms taking place in the brain for the use of language. So when we operationalize use of language, we actually find that there are certain branches of psycholinguistics. These are the main branches. First of all, the storage and retrieval of language in the brain. This is the precondition for us to use language, that it is stored in the brain and that we have access to it. Storage and retrieval of language. Second aspect, second branch, is language understanding or language reception. Both these terms are used. I don't really see any difference in them, but some researchers prefer understanding, others prefer reception. Third aspect is language production. How do we produce language, both in written and also in oral discourse? And the fourth one is language learning or language acquisition. Here again, sometimes distinction is made between the two terms, but there's no common agreement about whether we should distinguish, we should make a distinction between learning and acquisition. I'll come to this in a minute. Okay, now when we look at the historical development of psycholinguistics, we can, to a certain extent, distinguish between three main periods or three main phases. These phases obviously overlap. There are no discrete boundaries between them, but for convenience sake, I think it's quite sensible to make such a distinction. Now, the first phase is characterized by a main focus of language understanding. So it was mainly understanding experiments which were carried out, and the reason was simply the following, that namely the variables in reception experiments were considered smaller in number and could be controlled more easily in comparison to production experiments. So if you want to find out whether a person has understood a text, let's say a written text, what you do is you give the text to the person, ask her or him to read it, and then you can design particular questions and give these questions to the person who has read the text. And on the basis of this, you can find out to what extent the person has understood the text. Production experiments are much more complicated, and the factors involved are considered to be of a much larger number and of a much less controllable kind. The experimental design was the main research design at that time. So it was mainly experiments which were carried out, like, for instance, giving a text to a person and asking him or her to read it and ask questions about it. The second phase is characterized by language production and language acquisition becoming new foci of attention. So it does not mean that at that time no language understanding experiments were carried out anymore, but this is a sort of addition to these particular experiments, namely language production and language acquisition. The research design is mainly characterized by experimental studies and by computer modeling. So that was the time when artificial intelligence came into being, and the idea was that certain processes in the mind could also be modeled in the sense of a computer program, which would then run on a computer. The third phase, and that goes until the present day, is characterized by the three main branches of psycholinguistics being investigated: language understanding, production, and acquisition. And here we have a combination of several methods, a triangulation, so to speak, empirical methods, experimental research design, and by means of cognitive approaches, especially under the influence of cognitive science, which developed in the 80s and 90s of the last century. Okay, let me now come to the three main branches of psycholinguistics: language understanding, language production, and language acquisition and learning. In earlier times, language understanding was considered to be a rather passive process. So it was thought that we understand a text in that we take the meaning of the words retrieved from our memory, and then the text is understood. So, for instance, when we read a text, we see certain word forms, and when these word forms, when we take in these word forms and relate them to the meaning of these word forms stored in our memory, then we have actually understood the text. So understanding a text is sort of very simple, very simplistic process of relating meaning to word forms. This, however, is no longer considered to be an adequate view of language understanding today. Nowadays, language understanding is considered to be an active construction process. So, in other words, understanding a text means relating the meaning of the incoming information, the words and sentences of a text, to one's relevant knowledge stored in memory. So, in other words, language understanding is always dependent on two components: on our stored knowledge on the one hand, or at least on relevant parts of our stored knowledge on the one hand, and on the incoming information. And the two actually interact. And this interaction is language understanding. So constructing, this is another view on it, but it actually means the same. Constructing a mental model of the text means understanding the text, relating the incoming information to relevant parts of our stored knowledge in the brain. So this interaction of incoming, new and stored old information is language understanding. Now, within this process of language understanding, two complementary sub-processes in our brain actually interact. And these processes are called top-down and bottom-up processing. Top-down processing, sometimes also called concept-driven processing, means that we start from our knowledge and relate it to the incoming information. So, for instance, when we read a text, we already have a certain knowledge about this, and we start with this knowledge. We have certain ideas about what the text will be about, and then with every single word we take in, we relate this information from the incoming text to our knowledge in the brain. So this is top-down processing, starting from our knowledge. The second, bottom-up processing or data-driven processing, goes the other way around. We start from the incoming information and relate it to our knowledge which we have in our brain. So this already shows you that for texts whose themes we have no or hardly any knowledge about, top-down processing is not possible. We have to rely on the incoming information to build up new knowledge structures. So, for instance, if I was given a text on molecular biology, something I have no knowledge about or practically no knowledge about, then of course this is very difficult for me to understand, simply because I cannot relate the incoming information to anything I have concerning knowledge about this in my brain. And this obviously means that the understanding process of this particular text is severely disturbed. Either I understand practically nothing, or I may even understand something in a completely wrong way. So this already shows you that the interaction and a certain amount of harmony between top-down and bottom-up processing is actually necessary in human information processing. Otherwise, problems arise. I mean, this also applies to, for example, understanding a text in a foreign language. When you don't have the full competence of the foreign language, then it's very likely to happen that the text is not processed in a sort of optimal way, and as a result of this, problems in understanding are very likely to arise. Okay, so far about language understanding. The second is language production. Language production is definitely a complex human activity. And like all complex activities, language production involves planning. This, I think, is generally accepted. But what is not generally accepted is the relationship between the planning and the actual processing of, or the production of a text. Now, in earlier times, a clear distinction was made between a planning phase and an execution phase. So first we plan, and after we have finished with the planning, we then execute this plan and produce the text. Nowadays, however, this is no longer considered to be adequate, simply because we all know that we often plan while speaking or writing. So planning and execution are not considered to be two discrete processes any longer, but they overlap, they interact, and there are even doubts about whether such a distinction, planning and execution of plan, is really a fruitful one. So basically, nowadays, we modify this simple model of planning and execution of plan in such a way that, first of all, we do some global planning. And that means, for instance, when we want to write a text, let's say a letter to a friend of ours somewhere in the United States, or rather an email, letters are hardly sent anymore, but emails are. So we plan to send an email to a friend of ours in the United States, and we have some idea what we want to tell this person. So this then would be the global planning. And then we do the fine-tuning, so to speak. That's the local planning. And the local planning and the language production, that is the writing of this email, are very closely linked. So they interact. There's a mutual interaction between the local planning and the language production. So with each and every word we write, there may be certain feedback to the local planning. That is, we may modify our local planning, but there's also feedback on the global planning possible. So when we write a text, maybe new ideas will come into our mind, and then we may modify the plan according to these new ideas. So we see here, this is a sort of circle which goes round several times. We start with the global planning, then we have the local planning, the language production, and this then again can feed back to the various planning components in the process. But we all know that the degree of planning can vary considerably. So for instance, in an everyday, in a casual conversation, there is hardly any planning at all. At least there's a very low degree of planning. So imagine you meet somewhere in the market square here in Riga, a friend of yours, and you start chatting with her or him. You don't really plan this chat in advance, but you just start chatting and that's it. So there's no conscious planning involved in this. On the other hand, when you write an article or a lecture, or anything of that kind, this definitely involves quite a high degree of planning. So it depends very much on the particular text, on the particular text type, but obviously also on your experience. Some people need to plan much more a lecture or an article than others do. And this is definitely also a matter of experience. Okay, there are certain problems connected with language production. Problems pertinent in research in this particular discipline. So one problem you find here, and that's does the planning and execution of text, sentence, word occur sequentially or simultaneously. So there is some evidence for simultaneous or parallel processing in our mind. I mean, certain processes take place at the same time. They take place in a parallel fashion, and this is probably one of the reasons why our brain is such an efficient and complex instrument for language processing. Another problem is whether there are sub-processors for words, sentences, and texts. So this modular view of language processing is still something where there's no unanimous consent about. I think that nonetheless the research so far carried out has shown that there is some evidence for these sub-processors in the mind, obviously with interaction and under a global control unit. So these sub-processes cannot work entirely independently. This would lead to chaos, no doubt about. there must be a global control unit under which all these modules actually work. And this is also, I think, very well described in the book by Fodor, The Modularity of Mind. So, from all this, we can say that there's quite a high degree of similarity between language understanding and language production processes. Both are active processes. Both are processes in which active construction is necessary on the side of the language user. Okay, last point, language learning, language acquisition. So, first of all, I think it's fruitful, useful, helpful to distinguish between first language acquisition and second language acquisition, or sometimes also called second language learning. And sometimes there's even a distinction made between second language acquisition and learning. Acquisition applies to natural environments and learning to sort of non-natural environments. But as I said, this distinction is not generally made. And there's a third type that's called foreign language learning. I think it is a good idea to distinguish between these three types, because there are important differences which justify this distinction. So one very important aspect is that LL1, that is first language acquisition, is normally 100% successful, unless the child is impaired in some way or other. But normally, when a child learns through his mother tongue, the result is the full competence in that particular mother tongue. Second language learning, and especially foreign language learning, are normally less successful. No doubt, when we learn a foreign language, especially foreign language in a school in the country where the language is not used as the main means or an official means of communication, then it is not very likely that we acquire the full norm of this foreign language. Another very important fact is the age factor, which plays a very important role in language learning and acquisition processes. So it's well known that children, especially children before puberty, are more successful in learning a second language than adults. This is a matter of fact. Sometimes it is assumed, as a sort of explanation for this fact, that children before puberty can use strategies of first language acquisition processes, so that these strategies can be activated and learned and made useful for second language learning. This, however, seems rather doubtful. I don't really think that there is enough evidence so far to say that we can use strategies of the first language acquisition for second language acquisition again. At least not entirely. Another very important factor is environment. So learners of second language in a natural environment are generally more successful than learners in a non-natural environment in the classroom. So for instance, if a person goes to the United Kingdom and learns English there in communication with other native speakers in England, then the chances are much better to acquire a high degree of competence in English than if this same person would learn the language in a classroom in, let's say, here in Latvia or in any other country where English is not considered, is not the means of communication at all. So one factor which plays an important role here may be the time and amount of being exposed to the language. So when you are learning a language in communication with native speakers in the country where the language is used as a mother tongue, then you are exposed to the language maybe 12, 14 hours a day. When you learn a language in the classroom in a foreign country, you're exposed to the language maybe 8 hours per week, 10 hours depending, but definitely not to such an extent you would be exposed when you learn it in the country. Motivation also plays a very important role. It varies considerably. Pupils in the classroom have to be motivated by the teacher to learn the language. And this, as we all know, varies concerning its success. Whereas when you learn the language in the country where it is used as a means of communication, there is always the need for you to become a member of this particular speech community, at least under normal circumstances, an accepted member, and that means you have to learn the language in order to be able to communicate. I know there are differences concerning this, but generally speaking, we can say that the motivation is definitely higher when you learn a language under natural circumstances rather than in the classroom at school. Nonetheless, of course, there is a similarity of mental processes between the particular ways of language learning, L1, L2, and foreign language learning. I mean, the sole reason for this similarity is definitely the economy of the mental processes which take place in the brain. If we used completely different processes for learning a first, a second, and so on language, it would not be very economical. And all experiments concerning the brain have made clear is that the brain is an apparatus which works with a very high degree of efficiency and economy. So from this, I would very much assume that there must be some similarity between these processes. And this also becomes clear by a common learning strategy which can be found in all these types of language learning, and not only of language learning, but also of learning in general. And that can be called hypothesis formation and hypothesis testing. So this is actually a metaphorical use from the way we proceed as researchers. We form a hypothesis, then test this hypothesis. The hypothesis is then either corroborated or modified or rejected. So this can be illustrated by means of this example in English. For example, when a learner has come across past tense forms in English, such as asked, painted, rolled, picked up, etc., then the learner may form the hypothesis that past tense in English is verb plus ed. I mean, I'm not saying that the learner is aware of this in any way. I would think that in the vast majority of cases, the learners are not aware of this, at least in natural language acquisition processes. The school, it's different. But in natural language acquisition processes, the learners are generally not aware of this. But the way they behave, the way they use language, makes it clear to us that they must have formed this hypothesis. So after some time, this hypothesis is generated and then it is tested. So when the learner uses dropped, smashed, liked, and so on, he or she gets positive feedback. Positive feedback can also mean lack of negative feedback. And this then means that the hypothesis is corroborated. But, yeah, just 1 minute. So the learner may also come up with a form like goat, and here the learner would get negative feedback, which then leads to a change or modification of the hypothesis, namely there are regular forms according to past tense is verb plus ed, and irregular forms, which have to be learned by heart. And as you can see here, we know, or we get a great deal of information about this from error analysis, especially from those errors which are considered to be developmental errors, errors which occur in the language learning processes, and they only remain for a certain period of time, and then they automatically will disappear again. Well, that's basically what I wanted to present to you today, this short overview. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Do we have questions to the speaker? You're welcome. Yes, there is a question.
Thank you. Katrina Basha, Latvia. It's not a secret for you, of course, that in our country there are Latvian-speaking people and Russian-speaking people and some other languages-speaking people. What do you think, in your opinion, what is better for the groups learning a foreign language, English for example, to have homogeneous groups by the principle of Russian or Latvian, or mixed joint groups where both Latvian students and Russian students are learning? What is better, in your opinion? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I must say I don't really have a sort of clear opinion about this, because I think there are advantages and also disadvantages connected with both these settings. Generally speaking, I think that it is a good idea to have heterogeneous groups, because in heterogeneous groups, unlike homogeneous groups, the learners actually have different learning experiences with their mother tongues, for instance. And these learning experiences can be made or can be used in a fruitful way in order to learn another language, a second or a third language in this particular case. But I mean, it very much depends on the particular learning strategy or teaching strategies adopted by the respective teacher. I would not really say that homogeneous groups have certain disadvantages, but to my mind and also to my experience, I also teach in homogeneous and also in heterogeneous groups. I must say I find it in a way more rewarding to teach in heterogeneous groups rather than homogeneous groups. But I think it's also a matter of personal liking. Some people have got a better approach to language when they are in a homogeneous group, others when they are in a heterogeneous group.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Well, thank you, Professor. Oh!
Thank you very much.
Professor, there's one more question coming.
I did have a question. So according to, and I enjoyed the presentation very much, but according to your statement then, in your opinion, would my 3-year-old grandson Jack be hypothesizing about the word swimmed when he comes to me and says, Mimi, Papa and I swimmed? Are you saying that he was hypothesizing that that's a correct verb form?
Yeah, what I was saying is that when a learner says swimmed, it means, or we can interpret from this, that the learner has already found out this regular, this rule in English that past tense is verb plus ed. So what the learner does, he or she applies this principle to a case he or she has not heard before, has not used before, that is, to a new case. So from a number of examples, the learner sort of hypothesizes or generalizes a common principle. This is the first step. And the second step is the learner applies this principle to cases of an analogous kind. An analogous kind would also be cases in which the past tense form is not verb plus ed. So go, for instance. The fact that nonetheless the learner applies this principle to this particular case shows that he or she has already learned, acquired, or whatever you mention, whatever you will call this particular principle. And again, let me stress, the learner is not conscious of this. But nonetheless, he or she uses this principle in a contingent way.
Thank you. At this point, I would like to thank our keynote speakers once again for really giving us both the note and the key to the further work of the symposium. I wish to thank Terry McCarthy for giving us the note of passion. I wish to thank Professor Karapetiana for giving us the firm theoretical ground and also an insight into how applied linguistics has so far developed here in Latvia. And also I want to thank Professor Lörscher for giving us the stimulus, the response to which is coming, I'm quite sure, during the working sessions, and the response, I hope very much, you will be also providing from your home countries, your home institutions. Now in your programs,